days, that the Messiah would come and usher in the new world, and everything would be set to the way that God intended it to be. And in a sense, of course, that's certainly true, but not perhaps in the sense in which they thought about it or the way that they anticipate it by the time Jesus does actually arrive. It speaks of everyone in the world paying homage to God, to worship and to recognize who he is. And this is certainly something that has more of that apocalyptic understanding, that God's reigning would expand from being, for his chosen people to having everyone in the world recognize and understand who God is and worship him as a consequence. All right. Hey, look at that. My buttons are working. This is great. The verbs in verse 1, as a consequence, then both suit the idea of it speaking of a recent victory of God, that God led the people into some significant accomplishment or achievement over their enemies, or as an eschatological anticipation of the end times. And so people will argue with one another, scholars in Hebrew, about which it is that this means. And of course, my opinion is that you can pick either one. We don't have to be right about these things. And why not both? It could be both. That's the beauty of poetry, is that you can have these dual meanings and have multiple understandings very easily. But what is meant by the multitude of isles? The NIV is particularly bad about making non-literal translations of these things and trying to add sense. Bad maybe is the wrong word. Common. It's common for it to do that. But the literal word here is multitude of isles. Yes?
I think you're just talking about all the peoples or multitudes of peoples and just saying it's islands.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of it being something that would have to be far away would be across the sea in a sense, right? That you would have Israel here at one edge of the Mediterranean, and then far away you would have islands or people that are far away. So it's a kind of a figure for near and far. And of course, the words themselves, right? The earth and the islands themselves aren't actually what is expected to do the specific rejoicing. It's not the land itself. In anticipation, this is the metonymy of subject. If we go way back to the very first class we ever did in Psalms, substituting that as an image for what the inhabitants of these places, the people thereof. And this is very common. This is particularly common in this particular psalm. There's a number of these kinds of substitutions. Yeah?
And the idea about isles is it's every isolated people, so it's not leaving anyone out. So it says the earth and every isolated people, as it were.
Yeah, it encompasses the idea of the world entire as a figure. Exactly. But why choose clouds and darkness then for his coming? The verse 2, right? We have these particular ideas. This isn't necessarily something that we associate with God. God being a God of light, a God who brings light to the darkness. Why would clouds and darkness then herald his arrival? Well, I got a couple of, yes, please.
Is that kind of like the wrath that's coming, that you've done wrong for so long? Yeah, payment is due, judgment is due.
Yeah, I think that you're on the right track. I don't know if I would go specifically to wrath itself necessarily isolated, but as part of that whole package, certainly the idea of judgment or whatever. You're gonna
like just in the eschatological sense, it's the second coming of Christ isn't coming until we see all the wars and rumors of wars, all the dark things, Satan ruling in the world, and then Jesus comes. And those signs, so here in this one, the clouds and darkness represent all that evil, all that bad, all that, those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see where that would be the state of the world before, right, the redemption, or before God initiates his reign that sets everything right. But I think in this particular case, these are the things that are coming with God, and that it is more just trying to emphasize God's power and his acting in the world to set things right, that he was going to judge and bring justice. And there's a number of these terms that are going to talk about this. I mean, just in the very second half of this verse, It speaks of righteousness and justice as being the foundation of his throne. And God comes in the form of kind of the cloud in other places within the Bible as well, right? That in Exodus, right, we have, of course, the cloud that leads them, but God's power is exemplified through clouds in different ways, and lightning from heaven, with Elijah too, right? That when the false prophets, right, the priests of the Baal, who are trying to have their sacrifice accepted by their God, it's fire from heaven that comes down and ignites Elijah's sacrifice instead, right? And then as well, this is quickly followed by the end, right, of the drought. God's power manifests in the storm, right? We have the rainstorm that comes to end the drought, and then as well, subsequently, Elijah is there, and though it specifically says when God comes to visit him that God is not in the storm, right? You have the storm and the earthquake and then the quiet whisper. But these are things that are representative of God's power at different times and places. In this particular case, I think it is indicative of that wrath and judgment. I mean, he goes right on to talk about this righteousness and justice. The word justice here, did I put this in my note? I did. It's sometimes translated elsewhere, the same Hebrew word as judgment, even within the Bible. Not always just as justice. So it can go both ways. Why is judgment the foundation of God's throne?
There has to be a finality. You have so many time on earth for worship him is what they're coming about, and then there's a certain amount of time when he's going to judge.
Sure. I mean, there is a finality to it, yeah. And that this is something that he's going to do. We have to anticipate and expect that is coming. Sure. What makes it a foundation of God's power? Of throne meaning kind of his authority and his power that he has. Why would judgment specifically shore up or be a component of that? Yeah.
If you were that God and you claim to be justice and righteous, I would expect you to come with justice and pronounce justice in the world. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that would mean wrath on evil and so on, but justice for the rest of the world. So if he's coming and you see that his coming in this way, it's like that's to be expected if a throne or a kingdom is based on righteousness and judgment, that justice is coming. So that's where it's
it ties directly into the idea of power and authority. Yeah. Right? One of the most common or popular kinds of phrases that people have when they're feeling unfairly put upon in today's world is,
there is no justice.
You can't judge me. Oh. Right? We deny that other people have the right to tell us what to do. Right? People don't like that. And so when they say you can't do that, it is a denying of your authority over me. And saying that God has the right to dispense justice and judgment upon the entire world is yet another way of claiming God's sovereignty and God's authority and God's deity as being the divine creator. He is permitted, he is justified, he is entitled to pronounce judgment and justice upon the world and everyone in it. It is another way of describing who he is and his supremacy in this way. And this idea, again, that God can judge and has authority over the world ties in as we go further down in this conversation about people who worship idols, the false gods who do not have this kind of authority, who do not have this kind of power. Fire is image of final judgment. I was going to ask where else this appears. We have a number of things. I mentioned Elijah already. I tipped my hand because only in verse 2 and 3, and I'm well running out of time already. There is also, of course, the pillar of fire substitutes for the pillar of cloud in the Exodus, and a number of other places. It's a common figure. We have Nadab and Abihu suffering judgment by fire in Leviticus 10. They offered an inappropriate incense before God. And then there's another instance in Numbers 11. This one is less detailed in its description. Simply the people murmured against God and it was evil, and they were consumed by fire until Moses prayed for it to stop. So, there we go. Verse 4 could then be seen as well as an elaboration on 3. Lightning can be considered fire, certainly by ancient cultures. It causes fires. Lightning strikes often cause forest fires and set other things on fire, kind of damage. And it is also a thing that is obvious and manifest. Right? The idea of God's power, his judgment, his actions being clear and obvious, undeniable in the world, certainly also fits in with the eschatological kind of end times view of this psalm. What does it mean for a mountain to melt like wax? This is in verse 5. A mountain melting like wax. Okay, a lava flow is certainly a lot like that. Yeah, I'm not sure how common they would have known that in the Middle East at this time. I don't know much about active volcanoes. No volcanologist I, but that's certainly an apt image. Yeah, the idea, we've seen the videos of like in Hawaii, just the lava flow does look like melting wax slowly rolling down the hill. Yeah. Yeah.
But he is the creator. He created the mountain. He can certainly destroy it in such a way that it looks like wax. I mean, it just dropped down to nothing. I mean, we're trying to get an image of what, here's this great mountain, and now it's nothing.
Yeah, it's certainly the demonstration, or again, an image of God's power, right? That something that seems so solid, that something that seems so permanent, that seems so fixed, he can cause to just simply melt and disappear away, right? That he has sovereignty and control and dominion over these things. As well, the other thing that I ran across, and I have not seen as many of these, or there may, I don't know, regardless, whatever, is the landslides. That when a hillside gives way after too much rain or anything like that, that flow of dirt and rock and all the trees can also look very much like a kind of liquid, waxy kind of thing. The idea that it's just simply melting, away under the force of divine power makes for an excellent image. Again, the idea of something permanent and fixed, too large for us to deal with, just simply going away in seconds, makes for an excellent image of God's power and dominion. There's another reference very similar to this one in Psalm 46. This leads some commentators to think that this could actually be referring to a specific event, maybe one that is not particularly mentioned in the biblical text, but one that they would have known and made reference to. But that is purely speculative. You take it or leave it as you please. Talk about what it conveys. How do the heavens then convey God's righteousness? We have this in verse 6. They proclaim his righteousness. I'm going to get, it's not a trick question, but I'm going to be very narrow with this.
He created them.
He did create them.
So your creation honors.
We see other places, there's the phrase, the heavens proclaim the glory of God. They certainly manifest his creator. They speak of his power. They speak of the glory of God to be able to do such things. But is that the same as his righteousness? That God being powerful, is that the same as him being right? God being glorious, is that the same as him doing what's right? I'm getting some shaking heads, which is fine. I would be fine with nodding heads, but whatever you want to do. It's an interesting thing because this is a slightly different understanding than what we may think of normally, right? That we look around at creation and we see that God is manifest in creation. God must exist, right? That these things bespeak a creator, a powerful and glorious creator, but does it tell us that the creator is righteous? Yeah.
In one sense, people always ask, why is Earth the only place where people exist? Life exists. And God shows his righteousness in the sense that he built the whole heavens, he cast it out there, but he made one place where people exist. God is right to choose and decide that because he built everything else to support this one to make it work. And if God hadn't built it in exactly the unique way that he did, we're being told by scientists who are studying these phenomena that Earth couldn't exist, life couldn't exist on Earth if we were an inch off or spun the wrong way or any of the other things that weren't exactly in the right place, the sun and the moon and everything that's going on.
Sure, sure. It's an excellent point, right? That certainly that God has made and designed creation to be the place that is good for us, right? He made the world and saw that it was good. You go back to Genesis, and that's what you have there. I think, oh, yeah, Dennis, we're gonna, yeah.
Whoever has the power is right.
See, and I think, yeah, oh, I'm sorry, I'm gonna cut you off if you were done.
But
I think you're on the right track. And this is an interesting idea that we really oftentimes don't like. That God is righteous because of who he is. And part of that nature is his power. He is the creator. He is sovereign. And therefore, what he chooses to do is right. Now, I think you can get, I think you're still on pretty solid ground philosophically. This probably goes back to Anselm, and I hadn't planned to spend a ton of time on this, but the idea of understanding God's nature through understanding God's attributes, what he is like by who he is. And I think that you can make a fairly decent case that God has to then be righteous because of who he is. But the power that God has in his sovereignty, I think, is an extension then, speaks as well about his righteousness. And this can be an uncomfortable idea for us in our very modern context because we have a wonderful rhyme and phrase that we like to use that might does not make right. And certainly that is true for us, but we do not have the same might and power and glory and sovereignty and authority that God does, and therefore our might does not make us right. But I think you could make a reasonable case, and feel free to disagree with me, reasonable case that something different applies to God, because he is different from us in every way. He is so much greater, bigger, more than we could be and are. Yeah.
he spoke the worlds into existence
Yeah.
and everything within.
I think that idea is such an amazing and powerful one that we often do forget just how amazing it is, because we live with it every day as Christians and knowing it, that he is able to speak and the world's come into existence, that it is an extension of his continued will that we continue to exist, that we exist for no other reason than God wills that we should. That God wants the world to continue to be, the heavens to continue to revolve, and because of that they do, and if he didn't, they wouldn't. It's a mind-boggling thought. All right, again, I'm running slow, but we're gonna, he also has his judgment falling from heaven. We get this in the verses before with the idea of lightning, right? Righteousness is dispensed through his judgment, which also falls from heaven. The heavens bespeak this as well. Striking this down, and it becomes apparent. This is an obvious thing, that which comes from heaven. This falls in full view. Things which God does, you could say, in the public eye. These are things that all will see. The last half of verse 6, everyone will see that glory. Moving on to the people that oppose him, verse 7, those who worship idols are destined to be shamed because of their defeat and their judgment. The idea of, in the first half, that they're to be put to shame, the shame will come from the backing the wrong side, if you will. That they will have supported those in opposition to God, that they will have set themselves up against him, they will go down to defeat, they will suffer judgment to their own shame. And then he has an imperative. Worship him, all you gods. Speaking to the other gods, they are enjoined to worship Yahweh God, the one true God. Why do that? Why demand worship from these other false deities?
He's the creator.
Okay, he's the creator. He is entitled to it.
Man's work, but you
Sure.
have the free will to not worship him and separate yourself from him, but then he demands that you do.
Yeah, certainly we have this choice. It's an interesting question about the other gods, right? Do they have reality? If they do, have they this option? What kinds of beings are they? But
But aren't the other gods you're referring to man created?
yes and no. Well, boy, again, we could do a whole class on idols. What are they? Are they real? Right? But the idea certainly is that the idols themselves have no value. They're just simply human-created objects of wood, stone, metal, whatever they are.
Right.
But they are in places talked about as being representations of evil spirits, right? The demonic entities behind them that entice people away from following the true God. And so, yeah, it depends on the context as whether they have any real reality, as it were, or not. But you're right. Anything that does exist should worship God and glorify Him. There's no question about that. I saw, yeah.
I think this phrase is calling on the people who recognize the idols, those who are going to be defeated in their loss. But it's calling on them to recognize that their gods are so inferior that they even need to worship God. But then in reality, when Jesus was here, every time he met one of these evil spirits in somebody, the spirit would call out and say, "Why do you challenge us, the Son of God?" Or they recognize him as God, and they immediately offer their subjugation to him, even to the point of saying, "Please don't kill us, send us into the swine instead," in that one instance. And he lets them go to their pleading, but obviously the swine are insane and die, and so they're lost, whatever. So I think if they're calling on even the other evil or whatever, Satan, his angels, to recognize that they're in subject to God, not just the earth,
Yeah.
all powers.
Yeah, that it is everyone and everything that needs to do that. Yeah.
It brings to mind when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant and took it into their city. The idol god was prostrate itself in front of the altar.
Right, yeah. They capture the ark, they bring it in, set it up in front of their idol, and then every morning they come in and it has fallen over on its face in front of the ark. Yeah. Yeah, I think that whether or not the gods have any specific reality, whether they're simply just idols of wood or stone, or whether we're talking about the spirits behind this idea that deceive people, that saying it in this way is a kind of extra, kind of poetic way of dialing this up to 11, if you will. That everyone and everything owes fealty and worship to the Creator, to the true God. Whether or not it is a person, all the way up to any of these false gods that they may have. Everything. And it's kind of that poetic way of saying that even the things that you at least think would do this, or ought to do this, or should do this, or will do this, everything has to worship and to acknowledge who God is. And again, casting in that imperative form with the verb, right, as a command, just simply makes that stronger as a way of emphasizing this as much as possible. There is, of course, the argument that you'll see, and it is sometimes used this way, this word that is translated here, gods, sometimes is used to refer to angelic beings, or even powerful people on earth. But it seems pretty clear, especially from verse 9, using it again, that it is indeed referring to kind of those idols and so forth, not human powers of any kind. I was really not wanting to read this one in the NIV because in the more little translation, it's a little more obscure. But who or what is rejoicing, are rejoicing in verse 8? I really want to get to verse 11, so I'm kind of trying to hurry. I apologize if I'm feeling rushed. Zion, what is Zion?
Israel, Jerusalem, the great mountain.
Literally, it is the mountain. Yeah, exactly. But it stands in, kind of, again, as a metonymy of subject for representing Judah itself, or Jerusalem, or Israel writ large, right? The people of Israel. And then we have, it actually has a different phrasing. Let me go back here. This is going to be a lot of button presses. Hopefully this works. The daughters of Judah. This is literally what it says in verse 8. The daughters of Judah. And it's an interesting thing to go with daughters. Most of the time, when you have to pick one sex or the other to stand in for humanity, we go with male. But daughters is used. And the guess that most people think is the one that we should go with, there we are, is that this has to do with, did I put the next one? No. The words are feminine. We don't have this so much in English, where all of our nouns have a gender to them. They're masculine or feminine nouns. You know, a lot of other languages do, French and Spanish and I don't know what all, I'm not a linguist, but lots of them. And villages and towns are feminine nouns. And so again, this comes across as a poetic way, very likely, of referring to both the capital and all the other places. The mountain of Zion, the temple, the heart of the country, Jerusalem, and everywhere else. Going with daughters instead of sons because of the nouns. Yeah.
And I think he's using daughters because women birth our children. So he's talking about here at the present, but daughters because the future is coming in, all of your children. So
Yeah, could well be. It could well be that it is, I mean, Israel was as well matrilineal in terms of figuring descent, so you could, looking ahead for descendants, that could be a way to do it too. The righteous people of God are able to rejoice at judgment. This is the kind of the gist of 8, that they hear what is going on in the world, they see the judgments of God, and they're happy about them. This reminds me of the kind of aphorism from Chesterton about what it is that children and adults want from their stories being very different things. That we as adults, we like to see the ending where people are forgiven and things turn out okay and people are redeemed for what they've done wrong, because we know and are conscious of our guiltiness and understand our need for mercy and forgiveness. But children, at the end of their fairy tales, they want justice. They want the wicked to be served out what they had coming to them, and the people who did what was right to be rewarded, because in their innocence, they have no fear of judgment. And whether or not that's strictly true for the way that we think about stories, I think it is certainly true that when we are righteous, when we are innocent, we have no need to fear judgment. And the idea of this being, again, Zion and Judah, if we cast this into this eschatological kind of view, right, we're looking ahead. The people of God have no need to fear the judgment of God. Right? That we who are now adopted into the house of Israel, as it were, that we have been forgiven because of our participation in the blood of Christ, have no need to fear the judgment that is coming the way that the rest of the world should. And we can be glad at the second coming of the King. It's a moment for rejoicing, even though it comes with judgment. Yeah.
Another verse in the New Testament talks about us as Christians not wanting to take vengeance on somebody else, but leave room for the wrath of God. So I think this is that very thing coming out.
Yeah, it's
People are rejoicing because
it's not for,
justice happened.
yeah, not for us to do, but for us to witness. Yeah. Jeff, are you gonna? You're just going to intro. Okay. Didn't want to cut you off if you had an idea there. All right. I'm gonna run ahead a little bit because I really wanted to get to verse 11. This is the only instance of this phrase in the Bible. I love unique things like this. People who only have their name mentioned once. Things like that. This is the only time they use the phrase, light is sown. The NIV goes ahead and changes it. Light is shed. Other translations will refer to the breaking of the dawn. various other things in an attempt to try and understand and translate an unusual figure or metaphor. The word here is the one used for sowing or even scattering seed. You can even translate this, light is scattered upon the righteous. It is a very unusual way to describe what is going on here. What does this mean? This is not a trick question. It's not really a wrong answer because, again, being unique, no one's 100% sure they're getting it right. Yeah.
When Jesus came, he says he's the light unto the world. And he was at one time where he was the seed of the new man and started the church to bring us into relationship with God. So he was that newness and the light. And then he said to the Jews that they don't like the light that's come into the world. And Jesus is that light.
Yeah, certainly the light of the world has come into the world, and it's something that we should rejoice and celebrate about, and there's that contrast drawn. Dennis, were you going to?
God's light shines on everything.
Yeah, but it is something that is, certainly in the current time, right? Light, as well as the rain, common grace that is afforded to us all. Something that falls from heaven, as well as we've been talking a lot about. A lot of the metaphors and the ideas here are talking about things coming down from heaven. There is the idea of it being sown, right? The idea that it will grow and that it will continue to flourish, that there is a seed planted and that it will turn into something even greater. That this is being promised. This is, again, forward-looking, the idea that the light is sown now that will bloom and blossom later and come to full fruition at a time of judgment. But there's a lot of different ways that you could understand this, and I'm not sure that I have one that's clearly the right way and the only way to understand this. Because, again, it is a unique phrase. It is nowhere else used exactly like this, which is a very interesting kind of idea. But light generally is associated with that which is good. And it fits, right? The light is sown for or upon the righteous people of the world. The benefits of God are the nice things are for them. Yes, ma'am?
Make me think about the sun coming out after a bunch of gloomy days. It's just glorious.
Yeah. The coming of the sun, the dawn at the end of a long night, or even after, here in Washington, right? And the coming of the spring or the summer, after you've dealt with cloudy days for months and months. Yeah. All right, well, I am at my time, past my time. I have no time for complaints this morning. I'm sorry, I will not entertain those. But any final comments, questions? Something I had to rush past there at the end or didn't quite get to? No? All right, well, I appreciate everybody's time and your patience with me being a little slow to get off the mark this morning. So we'll talk about Psalm 98 next week.